This Future Cities Africa episode is brought to you by the Greater Tygerberg Partnership. The Greater Tygerberg Partnership is a development facilitation agency charged with a mandate to unlock Bellville's potential as a sustainable, prosperous, and inclusive leading African city. Maurietta Stewart, Head of Environmental and Heritage Management for District A+D at Bay and Tygerberg at the City of Cape Town, and Guy Briggs, Partner and Head of Urban Design at DHK Architects, are my guests today. We discuss successful placemaking to build inclusive African places. Moreta, Guy, welcome. A question to both of you. What are the unique opportunities for effective placemaking in African cities?
Placemaking is a value driven, intangible aspect of experiencing a place and space. So it's hard to pin down and engineer. And an African city, when I think about it and experience it, it's a place of transience, it's a place of making and creating. It's ever changing and it's growing. And Bellville is one of those places for me. People are constantly moving through this space. So the aspect of informality, in my perspective, is important to harness as people move through the space and creating a sense of place. So rather than creating and engineering built environment solutions, for me is to find where it's working and to harness and come alongside those aspects of placemaking. So, as built environment practitioners, we need to challenge our own notions of what placemaking is supposed to be and how we've been trained, and harness the informality and the creative nature and kind of spirit of a place.
Placemaking is a universal phenomenon. I really enjoyed Marietta's thoughts on that. I gave some thought to this earlier. To me, there are three things in particular that stand out in Africa. And of course, Africa is an enormous place, so to generalize about African cities is also a presumption. But firstly, the question of community. There's an enormous strength of community across many and various African cultural philosophies. And here in South Africa, it's encapsulated in the concept of Ubuntu, where we're all bound together. And the community or the common good is more important than the individual. So that very notion needs to be at the heart of making place and making public spaces. Secondly, and again, a gross generalization, but climatically, the climate across most of Africa, notwithstanding the fact that it's pouring with rain outside today here in Cape Town, but generally, Africa has a mild to hot climate, and this lends itself to life outdoors. So life is public, and that in itself contributes hugely to a way of making place across this continent. And then thirdly, the role of nature and the potential to integrate nature. And I think especially of trees and the role that trees play across the African continent, spiritually, culturally, they have medicinal value, they have an obvious role in terms of climate mitigation, so providing shade, shelter, etc. And they're iconic. And I think they're actually a hugely undervalued resource and a very simple resource that can differentiate the way we make places in Africa and in South Africa.
Guy, can you give me an introduction to the top 10 factors to be considered in successful placemaking initiatives?
I think that there are spatial factors and I think there are non-spatial factors, and that contribute equally to placemaking. And on the non-spatial side, placemaking is not playing in sandpit. One needs to start with a strong vision, a vision of what kind of place, what kind of character, what kind of people, what kind of activities, what do we wish for out of this place that we're creating. I think we also need to be clear about what we mean by placemaking. So to me, to answer this question, one needs to have an understanding of place as being much more than a space. A place is a settlement. And it's the physical structure of that settlement and the activity that's generated in that settlement, along with the people that are generating that activity. So critically, good, strong placemaking involves partnerships. Partnerships between those who are making the places and the communities that are going to occupy them, be they residents, be they business people, whatever, be they visitors, workers. It also needs partnerships between public sector and private sector. Either one of those entities cannot deliver successful places on their own. There needs to be a multi-sectoral approach. So it's not just something that is incumbent upon built environment professionals, but it needs to have very strong involvement from, obviously, transport professionals, but also the health sector, economic sector, etc., etc. I think it's critical that placemaking is culturally specific. So a thorough understanding of local cultures and local climates is vital for placemaking. And then I think once you've got a place in place, so to speak, the ongoing management and maintenance of that place, that settlement, those spaces is vital to ensuring that the sense of place is retained. So that's 5 non-spatial factors, and then 5 spatial factors that come to mind. First and foremost, the overall structure of a place. That it has clarity, that it has legibility, that people can find their way around it, that spaces are well defined physically. Secondly, connectivity, both internally and externally. A good place is well connected to its immediate environs, but it's also well connected strategically to places further afield. Thirdly, intensity. And by that I mean both the density of built form, but also the intensity of activity that is taking place. And ultimately, that intensity of activity means an intensity of people occupation. And there's an old adage in the urban design world that people are attracted to people. The busier a place is, the busier it will become, because people want to gather there and be part of that busyness. Fourthly, the question of variety and mix. A good variety of uses, a mix of uses, and those factors working together generate opportunities, which work together to enhance a place. And finally, the structure and physical forms of a good place need to allow for flexibility for change, so that the place can adapt as the context changes, whether it be economic context, cultural context, or climatic context. And those are all factors that we are very familiar with, not just in Bellville, but in our current context in South Africa and across Africa.
And what are the challenges to incorporating some or all of those considerations within an African context?
It's a challenging question, and it's a challenging question because it requires a challenging response. I didn't give a lot of thought to this because I didn't have to, because what immediately springs to mind when one thinks of the African context and making good and successful places in Africa is fundamentally weak governance. And the weak governance, whether it's manifested in terms of corruption, whether it's manifested in terms of a kind of don't care attitude, paternalism, or simply in terms of limited resources, lack of financial resources, lack of human capacity to deliver. That function, weak governance, ultimately undermines many of the notions I was talking about earlier. The question of partnership, the role of vision, and vision is delivered through leadership. Many of those are utterly undermined by weak governance. So the places that really work in Africa are often places that are organically delivered. But they very often have many weaknesses to them. And those weaknesses are derived from the fact that there's a lack of partnership, there's a lack of leadership, there's a lack of vision. And that leads to short-term and long-term problems. We're not immune from that in South Africa. I think our structures are far more resilient than they are in many other countries across Africa. But we do, I think it's anyone who reads the news would recognize that we do have some of those problems.
Guy, how do you preserve a place's authentic character alongside the introduction of new placemaking interventions?
So the question of character, firstly, we need to recognize what that character is that gives the place its authenticity. And I think very often when people think about character, certainly built environment professionals think about character, we think about physical structures, the buildings, the spaces and places. But we forget that character is created by both tangible and intangible assets. It's not just the buildings and spaces. It's fundamentally around the community and social networks and the activities that are generated by those. And that's in the present. But of course, it is also about the social history of a place and the social history of its spaces. And I think that, we've seen recent evidence of a failure to understand that in the whole debacle around the River Club development that's now been stopped by court interdict because of a failure to properly address the question of character and heritage and whose heritage is it, etc., etc., etc. And we neglect those aspects at our peril. Too often we run roughshod over and are myopic about how broad character is and how different multicultural societies as we inhabit, how there are many, many different interpretations of character. And all of those have equal value and need to be recognized and understood.
Guy, final question for now. What are the main priorities for successful placemaking interventions in Bellville today?
So this question, I think, leads on very neatly from the previous question, because to start to get to grips with the priorities in Bellville, I think we need to understand Bellville's past, its present, and its future. Bellville's past its written history is relatively short, and it is inevitably dominated by an Afrikaner nationalist or apartheid legacy. And much of its built environment was certainly delivered in that era. And so it begs the question, how does one preserve those cultural artifacts intelligently and sensitively? And at the same time, how do you recognize and represent the history of those who were oppressed by that system, by those cultural artifacts? In terms of the present, it's currently a culturally diverse and bustling environment. And I think that public space interventions right now in Bellville need to balance a whole bunch of different competing or complementing needs and activities. On the one hand, there are the various different immigrant communities, ranging from Somalis to Ethiopians, as well as others that have come in the past and are still coming in. One needs to balance the needs of formal and informal businesses, and of course the overlapping uses of transport, trading, servicing, etc., etc. Looking to the future, the Bellville Future City Master Plan has presented a vision of Bellville as a high-density living and working environment, a majorly dense settlement within the broader Cape Town metro. And in that master plan, the core central area, the current CBD, will become a pedestrian environment supported by a strategic public transport infrastructure. So I think placemaking initiatives in Bellville now need to recognize the past with all its difficulties. They need to cater for the current needs, and they need to provide direction for Bellville's future.
Maurietta, how important is heritage in creating inclusive spaces, particularly in places where heritage and memory are contested?
I believe heritage is very important in creating inclusive spaces. Heritage is also a very complex animal. It's not a straightforward concept to understand, and not everyone understands it in the same way. Heritage is often interpreted differently by different groups in society and understood completely differently. It's contested, it is misunderstood, sometimes it's construed and used for certain agendas, it's used for political agendas, it's used for activists, and in different parts of society will use heritage in particular ways. But heritage is also deeply part of one's identity. And I think when I think of heritage, I think about inheritance. So for me, inheritance, it's a tangible something and it's intangible. It has value for me in many ways. And what drives me in heritage practice is that idea of inheritance is that we are building a future. We are making meaning from what happened in the past. We are bringing that story into the present, whilst more heritage is being made. And some are trying to figure out what we are going to leave behind for our future, for the future generations, and for the youth who are using those spaces. What is it going to mean? What are we leaving behind? What legacy am I leaving behind? So, how does one take that kind of complex thinking around heritage and use it for inclusion in spaces? I think we shouldn't get too bogged down about what story we're telling too much. I think heritage should be used as a provocation. It should be used as a catalyst for engaging. It should be in the public realm. We need to move away from our static ideas of what heritage should be and what it looks like, moving away from the man on a horse and the beautiful architecture and building, especially in places like Bellville, where we have all these different, like a melting pot of all these cultures and different heritages from different parts of Africa that's kind of mixing, and new heritage is being made all the time. But we have this memory of the past. So it's extremely hard to bring that, as Guy said, the Afrikaner kind of heritage of the past, which still has value for certain people. How do we tell that story? We can't erase it. It's still valuable to some, and it can provide platforms for understanding whilst creating this new heritage. So I think it's important to deal with it face head on. It's important to confront heritage of the past and confront the current heritage being created and produced in the public realm. I think it shouldn't be held within monumental spaces and buildings. It should be engaged with. And that's where the inclusion comes in. Can draw from artists and performers and other creative expressions in dealing and confronting those things and create inclusive spaces. Whilst heritage is quite in our formal sense of how we understand it, we think of buildings and monuments. For the vernacular, for the community, or whatever word you want to use, community being a contested term of who we are catering for, it means completely different thing. So we need to push ourselves in how we understand heritage, and not be afraid of the contestation, so that we can move towards that kind of debate in public space as we confront all these things, as we pass them, as we walk through space. And I think that moves us towards a deeper understanding of each other.
Maurietta, what are the considerations for using heritage to build inclusive communities?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on what Guy said earlier about the participation and partnership. I think that's very important in how we represent heritage and how we use heritage. As heritage practitioners and the field of in the built environments, we have tools that aren't always flexible in different places, in different spaces. We use a particular way of mapping, we use a particular way of identifying significance, and then we bring that formal lens and try to impose it on something that's very dynamic, especially in a place like Bellville. So, how do we change that way of thinking in a place that is dynamic? Because our city is growing, it's one of the fastest growing cities in the world. If we think through what urbanization is looking like for us and in migration of people, we cannot impose a way of managing heritage that is rooted in a static way of thinking about preservation and conservation. So, one of the main considerations for me would be involving people in how we map, thinking creatively and what kind of tools we could use to do that. Is there a way to use, especially in Bellville, where there is a massive student population because of the university coming through the taxi ranks and on the public routes? Is there a way to use apps to identify certain things with photographs and Is there a way to map it through that kind of tool? Is there a dynamic public space where we can use art and performance in considering how we present heritage that isn't a tangible physical monument or a plaque? We need to be creating meaning for everybody and adapt our tools in how we present heritage. I'm very intrigued by the idea of everyday heritage in building inclusive communities is the idea that heritage is made and there are practices that people are nurturing that are becoming ritual, that is becoming living heritage, that is growing and changing. How are we facilitating that? It's in how we spatially include people in our city, how we are planning for our city. Are we removing people from their ability to practice their heritage as they go through their daily lives by spatially separating them? Or are we providing those inclusive spaces where heritage can be made and build community and build social cohesion? So that's the kinds of things I would consider in building an inclusive community through using heritage.
And what are the specific opportunities for heritage linked placemaking in Bellville?
So Bellville is one of those places where I haven't dived in and experienced fully, but I've read about it, I've passed through it, I've spent minimal time in it, but through reading about it, I think oral histories are going to become important in how we present those. We see, as Guy mentioned, these big monumental structures with spires going into the air that presents a particular, almost oppressive symbol for most of the people who are going to pass through there. How can we counter that thing, that object? I believe oral histories and involving more narratives in those spaces and around those spaces could help. So using those existing structures that have a particular meaning and try to kind of or flip the narrative or create a new narrative on it. I'm very aware of the youth that are so ever present in Bellville. What contemporary ways, opportunities are there? I've been chatting to some people about the taxis are so ever present everywhere. Is there a way to use the taxi industry in the taxis using art, through music, through ways of engaging that system for opportunities to express this melting pot of all these things? Art, expression through public art could be one way. The open spaces especially, and I know there's a challenge around safety and creating safe spaces, but how can one leverage that beautiful central linking space along the river for this placemaking and using heritage through landscaping, through planting indigenous plants, through engaging children in creating a beautiful space with indigenous knowledge? I think it's just limitless in how we can think through that. But I think it's important to shift our perspective of heritage as being obstacles, as being inflexible, of being conservative and colonial, to being this dynamic thing that we are making. And I think we need to push that idea of heritage in a place like Bellville, in the city actually. We are living in an ever changing city and we need to be flexible in how we address and respond to heritage making.
Guy, I saw you nodding and agreeing to the comments that Maurietta made. Do you have any thoughts to add to her insights?
I loved listening to what Maurietta had to say, especially about heritage, because I'm by no means a heritage practitioner. I have sufficient amateur knowledge, I should say, to be thoroughly dangerous when it comes to heritage. But the insights that Maurietta brings in terms of heritage, in terms of it being a living, tangible thing, the everyday heritage, it really resonates with me. Because to me, what is important for us to understand about cities is how the lived experience of cities and spaces and places is what makes them real. And it is the lived experience that is in so many ways similar, whether you in successful cities in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, the lived experience of day-to-day street life. You know, the little rituals, the trading, the sharing food, the exchanges, the conversations, and that creation of of an everyday heritage. And of course, the everyday heritage of a street in Cairo is different to the everyday heritage of a street in Qatar. But there are very strong similarities, and it's the differences that make them culturally specific and contextually specific, and that ultimately become the thing that is the tangible heritage of a place. So I find those things far more interesting than, as Maurietta says, the bronze man on horseback or the spire reaching to the heavens. I mean, the Bellville architecture, the modernist architecture, I rather enjoy because it's quirky, but I enjoy it as an architect. And I don't have the visceral reaction to it that anybody would understandably have who has come from a past of oppression. I was myself excluded from that environment, but I was excluded on the basis of language and cultural identity and having a slightly different religion. But I wasn't excluded on the basis that I was supposedly other and supposedly inferior. And that, of course, is the dreadful legacy that for many people will long be associated with those buildings. So dealing with them in a sensitive manner is an enormous challenge, but deal with them we must.
And Maurietta, do you have any closing thoughts?
One of the things that resonated with me, the guy spoke about, was this interaction with nature, with the value of trees in a landscape. And it is so similar to what in heritage speak is a cultural landscape. Is that as people, we leave an imprint on the landscape we inhabit, but in doing so, we are creating like a genus loci, we are creating a particular character of place. And that cultural landscape quality is probably more of the intangible part, but it is what speaks a bit more to the intangibility, the intangible value of a place that people connect with. It's visual, it is experiential in how we feel when we're in the place, and it's a sensorial kind of experience that makes us create this picture and identity of place. So cultural landscape qualities of Bellville is important to consider when we create this narrative of heritage of it.
Maurietta, Guy, thank you very much for these great insights.